This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Jay Buddha Shefsky, author of How and How Not to Be Happy. Links to learn more about Jay Buddha Shefsky can be found in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. And of course, a special thanks goes out to our patron Alex at the executive producer level. We are a member of the Parthenon podcast network. You can learn more about great shows like Professor James.Earley's Key Battles of American History podcast by going over to parthenonpodcast.com. You, of course, can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies, by going over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you again for joining me Beyond the Big Screen. Thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Big Screen. I am really happy to be joined today by author Jay Budziszewski to talk about the philosophy and practical side of happiness, what happiness is not, and how to achieve happiness in a better way. Jay Budziszewski is a professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, and he discusses the nature of happiness, and that's really the question for today. And I think a good way to get started is, are people happy? Do you think people are happy? Are you happy?
Well, okay. I think that, when we ask people whether they're happy these days, they tend to say yes in lower numbers than ever before. Now, it varies enormously according to how you ask the question. You may only get 33% if you say, are you happy? You may get 90% if you say, are you satisfied with your personal life? So I don't think that we can take those numbers too seriously, but it does look from that and many other things. Talking with people, interacting with strangers at the bus stop. When I teach my students, I have the impression that although most people have some share in happiness, not many are simply happy. And there's a good deal of brokenness and misery out there. And I think this is on the rise. As I said, you can't necessarily take it seriously when what people say in answer to a survey question. But on the other hand, suicide rates are going way up. All kinds of other indicators suggest that people are having a problem. People are having a problem. Now, you also asked, am I happy? Well, let's distinguish between having a good time and having a good life. As the philosopher Mortimer Adler once did, I'm having a good time talking to you. I'm not always having a good time like everybody else. I have better days and I have worse days. I know the difference between leading a good life and not. When I was a young man, I was desperately unhappy and at one point really wanted to die. But I am by God's grace living a good life now. I am, so I don't think that I'm not a sage or a guru, but I don't think that I'm being an imposter and writing a book about happiness.
And you really would say that, just to kind of lay out the goalpost, sort of, that happiness, you could go through a good chunk of your day being unhappy situationally, but in overall be happy, and that there's kind of a hierarchy of happiness.
Well, the thing is that your feelings are not the same as happiness. Happiness is not something that you're feeling. It's something that you're doing. It's something that you're doing in a continuing and an abiding way. Feelings fleet. They're here today and gone tomorrow. And happiness isn't. This is one of the hardest things for us to get our minds around. How could happiness be an activity? It's not a physical activity. I'm not running. I'm not speaking, but we're making decisions. We are exercising our powers. We're using our minds, we're using our social abilities, we're doing things at every moment of the day, and we're making choices as we're doing this. People sometimes say, don't you think happiness is a choice? Well, not in the sense that you can simply choose, I will be happy now and be happy, but it is involved with making continuous choices and carrying them out. And these are all activities. It's a life that is united and hangs together in a rational and meaningful way that's directed toward the truth.
I thought it was pretty interesting, your anecdote about how your students have defined happiness and how that's changed over time. You said that in the past, they used to think things like, they would say wealth, friends, family, etc. Now they explain it as the absence of suffering, or they kind of explain it in a negative way. How has at least how you've perceived what your students perceive as happiness? How has that changed maybe over your career?
Well, now part of the reason for that anecdote may have been that particular very strange response when I got to my question, what is happiness, was when I was speaking to a freshman class. Sometimes I get much more mature responses from other students, but it was shocking because for years I've been doing a little routine like Aristotle used to do. He would lead up with the people that he was speaking to and teaching to where they recognize that there is something that we want for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. And he would say, well, what is that? They would say happiness. And then he would say, well, what is happiness? And all of a sudden they disagreed again. Some of them would say honor, wealth, pleasure, virtue. People today may give some of the same answers. And I found that this exercise works really well in my classes. I used it for years. And then we could talk and I could say, well, what about honor? Would you say that you would be happy if you were honored for qualities that you didn't really have? And people say no, and that leads them to reconsider. But with this class, I said, what is happiness? And the first half dozen students who answered all gave variations on the answer, nothing but pain and suffering. That floored me. I said to the first one, well, okay, thanks. I'm sure that if we are experiencing deep pain and suffering, we're not happy, but that's what happiness isn't. Can you tell me what it is? And then the next student, as sort of obliviously, said, well, it's not having all that pain and suffering. And I emphasized, no, I'm looking for the positive element. And 4 more students still responded the same way. Finally, one says, well, I guess if it isn't the absence of pain and suffering, I guess it's just what? Pleasure, which is still striking out, but at least he identified a positive element. And we could talk about that and why you can have all the pleasure in the world and not be happy.
Yeah. And it's really interesting how it's changed from so many people giving that an apophatic definition of happiness instead of giving the positive definition. And why do you think, just to maybe give a time reference, because you didn't write the book today, so it was, over the course of several years that this has happened, or was this a fairly recent?
I've been seeing this change. Yes, this is my own hunch, and I don't know how I could completely verify and confirm this, but I think that. Before even this happened, there had been a stronger and stronger drift towards students in my classroom saying, well, happiness is pleasure. What else could it be? And then I started getting this stuff about the absence of pain. I think what's happening is this. There's something that some philosophers call the hedonistic paradox. Happiness is not the good. It's good, but it's a secondary good. It's what we experience when we attain some real good. I have a friend and I experience pleasure. But the primary good there is the friendship. I discover the truth and I have pleasure in the truth. I rest in the truth, and that's pleasure. But the main thing there isn't the pleasure, it's the truth. Well, if you go for pleasure in and of itself, if you just aim at pleasure, say, I'll do what gives me pleasure, I won't do what I won't, you are going to burn out. You're not going to have much pleasure. You are going to have a lot of pain. Now, I think in the old days that the hedonistic paradox, call it that, used to kick in when people were older. I don't know, maybe 35. They'd lived for pleasure, and it just wasn't working, and they'd burn out. But many young people throw themselves into pleasure with such abandon today that I think that they're burning out younger. I think they're coming up against the hedonistic paradox at earlier and earlier ages, and that may have been part of what I was experiencing in, hearing these students in this class. And now it's paradoxical because they tell themselves things that aren't necessarily the same as what comes across to a person who is listening to them, because the same students sometimes wrote in their mid-semester course evaluations things like, I am having an awesome life. And yet they're telling me that awesomeness is nothing but the absence of pain and pleasure. There's a disconnect there.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Is there a way that you could really, if you had all the resources in the world, to do some sort of long-term study of how somebody's happiness views change, to really see like what the person is thinking when they hit that hedonistic paradox, or, how their views on happiness change? Because I would say, like anybody, my view on what happiness was when I was 20 is quite different than what my view on happiness is now that I'm well past 20.
Yes. Well, I suppose we could undertake such a survey. We'd have to be very careful. There are a lot of psychologists doing very large studies of what they call happiness today by asking people questions, by surveys. Often these are self-administered subjective happiness surveys. Are you happy? Are you satisfied? Are you this? Are you that? What makes you happy? And the assumptions that we could do this, but I think that we'd have to do it differently than we do it now, because the assumptions that go into those surveys tend to be all wrong. Most of these psychologists tend to assume that happiness is a feeling in the first place, and that influences how they even structure the questions. They're also trying to rely on the answers to questions, and that's not wrong. We can talk to people, but just answering a question doesn't give you the answer that you can get in a conversation. We need to know really whether somebody is happy, or to understand even whether I am happy. I need to reflect on it. I may need to talk with wise friends. And people often come to different conclusions then. This is why the classical method for studying happiness wasn't survey questionnaires. It was dialogue. And that's really a philosophical method rather than a mass sociological method. So I'm not sure how we could do a study of that. We could at least make a large-scale study of people's opinions about happiness, but that wouldn't be the same as a large-scale study of happiness.
Maybe we can start fleshing out this whole idea of happiness some more. What do you... in your definition of happiness, maybe what was your personal journey through happiness?
Well, my personal journey through happiness was when I was a young man. It was pretty miserable because I became infused with, I absorbed some of the drifts of today's intellectual culture. It's deeply skeptical. You're considered, when I was a very young man, I was full of intellectual pride. I thought I was smart. And so unconsciously, when I'm picking up that not being a moral relativist is considered smarter, you get more approval from teachers, you get more approval. People think, oh God, I think I absorbed that intellectual atmosphere, and I became more and more skeptical. I stopped believing that there was an objective difference between good and evil. I stopped believing that there was a God. I had been raised in a Christian faith, and I believed it. I accepted it, but I abandoned that. I stopped actually even believing. I didn't believe in personal responsibility and free will. And if you aren't actually personally responsibly making decisions, then what are you? You're not a person. Are you some sort of a mechanism or something? So I stopped believing in persons, and this is a mess. This did make me unhappy. I mean, I was married early. We had children, and I loved my wife and children. But what is love? Love is a commitment of the will. It's an enduring commitment of the will to the true good of another person. And I'd reached myself to the stage where I thought there is no real such thing as good. We all make it all up. I have no control over my own commitments, and I don't believe in persons. So yes, I loved them, but on the other hand, I couldn't even make sense of that love. And this was a very miserable condition. Now, in my case, I didn't think my way out of this. I really can take no credit for getting out of this. I was brought out of it surely by the grace of God, because rather than telling me the way you're thinking is wrong, this misery just fed into my intellectual pride further. And I thought, well, I'm one of the smart ones who can see that there's absolute emptiness at the heart of the universe, who can believe that and still live. So it was a sort of a macho nihilism. Do you know, there's a pop culture nihilism. I'm too cool to believe that anything means anything. There's a sort of a despairing a nihilism. I'm in existential dread because nothing because nothing means anything. And then mine was this macho nihilism. I'm one of the tough ones who knows that, and yet I live. It was so that isn't what broke it for me. It was a long path out of that. And when I was brought out of that, it took years, really, I would say, for God to put my intellect back together, where I could think in a way that I would call sanely, and eventually to think about some of these more specific things, like, well, what is happiness? Experience helps. Studying Thomas Aquinas helps, and Aristotle. These guys. There were a lot of wise people over the years who have written about happiness. I wrote about 660 pages of line-by-line commentary on Thomas Aquinas' treatise on happiness and ultimate purpose, and that helped me out for writing this book. But although here I'm trying to just engage in a kind of a conversation with my reader and get through to the meat of this.
Aquinas comes up a lot in the book. What did Thomas Aquinas, he's living in the 1200s. Is happiness something that had a different conception to him than it does to us today? Or what are some of the things maybe that are similar to the way somebody like Thomas Aquinas would have thought about happiness all the way back in the high Middle Ages versus what we might think about happiness today?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say that I mention Aquinas a lot in these pages. I tried actually to refer to him only sparingly because I thought it would scare away some of my readers. I guess I didn't succeed. But, there is an idea that's floating around that what somebody said, especially a white European male, give me a break, back in the 1200s, what could that say to us? Everything's different now. Well, human nature hasn't changed. What happiness has not changed. It's just a matter of what we understand about it. There are some things that we understand better now. We understand electricity. They didn't even know that there was such a thing as electricity. But on the other hand, Thomas Aquinas is much further from many of the common fallacies, like whether happiness lies in pleasure. And he was the beneficiary of centuries of Christian thought and pagan philosophical thought, and he was in dialogues sometimes with Jews and with Muslims and with their thought. So he had a lot to say about this that still speaks to us. And I had mentioned in speaking with my students, I led them through an exercise that Aristotle had used too. And the students will answer, well, maybe happiness lies in honor, maybe it lies in pleasure, maybe it lies in wealth. Thomas Aquinas, it's terrific. He takes up those alternatives, but he takes up lots of others too. He distinguishes between sheer fame and glory, not the same thing. He talks about all sorts of alternatives. Does happiness lie in power? Aristotle hadn't even discussed that. Does it lie in this? And a lot of these things, people. So this was extremely helpful to me. It also helped me to. There's a rigor to this kind of thought, even if I may disagree on some detail with Thomas Aquinas, with Aristotle. There's a rigor to this thought, and you can identify what the issue is. You can see where the two thinkers disagree with each other. How Aristotle almost gets certain things that Thomas Aquinas will take and he'll push him further. But if you say that, then shouldn't you say this? It's eye-opening. It can be breathtaking. And I think I teach my students these writers, and they may come into the class thinking, I have nothing to learn from them. But then they're often astonished by the time the class is over that there was so much meat here and things that they hadn't thought about.
Can you maybe take one example of something that Aquinas thought out?
Well, yes. We can give a couple of them. One is this business about, we touched on it earlier, about pleasure. Even many philosophers assume that happiness must be pleasure. Utilitarianism, which is a doctrine that holds that nothing makes something good or an act good or bad except its results, and in the classical form, you would measure the results by pleasure. This is a pretty crude idea. The ancients would have laughed at it. Most of them. There were a few who did buy into that, but even they had more sophisticated ideas about pleasure than many of the utilitarians. But how do you make that mistake? Whenever there's a mistake, this is really important, I think, and it's important for teachers to know, as well as philosophers and ordinary people in their lives. Whenever there's a mistake, there has to be some element of truth in it, some grain of truth for it to even be plausible. So what's the grain of truth in the idea that pleasure is the good? Well, if a life were completely devoid of pleasure, you wouldn't call such a person's life happy. And this is true. That's very far from saying that happiness and pleasure are the same thing. And it's a difficult thing for people to make that distinction. Thomas Aquinas and the classical philosophers did make it. Then you can say, well, what kind of a good is it? Look, I experience pleasure when I do things, but there's a difference between, let's call them primary and secondary goods. I may suppose that I used to ask my students, what if I put you in an experience tank? It was like the Matrix. You thought that you were experiencing things and you weren't really. You thought that you had friends, and so you had pleasure, but you didn't really have friends. They were illusions. You thought you knew God and you had pleasure. You thought that you had a lovely wife and children, and this was all an illusion, but you had pleasure. Then would you choose to be in the tank? We would arrange it so that it was the most pleasurable life you could have. A lot of my students said yes. Then I thought, well, they said, if you think you're doing it, it's the same. I realized that I was distracting them with the element of simulated experience. So when I changed the example, I said, okay, we now know that there is in the brain a pleasure center. If an electrode is dropped into the pleasure center for the brain, this has been done with rats, one experiences intense pleasure. Suppose we give you the option. We're going to sedate you. We're going to drop an electrode into the pleasure center of your brain, deliver very mild voltage. You'll feel great. And we'll lay you on a gurney and have IVs delivering all the nutrients that you need. And you will be just conscious enough to be fully conscious of all the pleasure, but nothing else. The greatest quantity of pleasure that you could possibly experience, we guarantee it to you to the end of your life. You're lying on this gurney. Now they're not distracted by the element of simulated experience. And I say, would you choose this? Surprisingly, a couple still would.
And that is surprising.
Yeah, well, it is. It's disappointing too. But most now would say no, because I wouldn't really be having a friend, which is pleasurable. I wouldn't really be experiencing truth. I wouldn't really be living. It's those things in a real life that I want. Right. That's it. Thomas Aquinas says, pleasure is a good, but it's a secondary good. It is the experience of resting in something else that's good. I rest, I repose in, I experience the friendship. And so I have pleasure, but it's the friendship that's good. If in my friendship, I aim just at the pleasure, I'm not really practicing the friendship anymore. And probably it's going to be a bad friendship and I'll lose it. If I just go for that jolt of pleasure when I study some subject, I'm soon going to lose interest in truth because I just want that pleasure, and I'll get the pleasure in other ways and I won't have any truth. And that'll be a kind of a cheap pleasure. This idea of pleasure as repose in a good that is different than itself, that's very important. It's liberating. It's a hard one. That's a kind of abstract, but you'd be interested by how the eyes of students open up when they get that.
It's so interesting. I've been reading a lot of other books on drugs, and in a lot of ways, drugs are that point where you can make pleasure pretty much on demand. But then there's so much pain that goes along with it as well, physical pain, emotional pain that goes along. And I think in a lot of ways, that is the person laying in the bed who's sedated, but who can get a jolt of pleasure every few minutes or whatever. And they're getting the out. So maybe you can pick apart what I'm saying here is they're getting the outcome of pleasure, but they're not getting any of the building blocks that get them towards the pleasure. They're not earning their own pleasure or experiencing what it takes to get pleasure.
They're not having the good things that pleasure signals us you're enjoying right now. They're just having the feeling of enjoyment, which is the same as actually enjoying it. This is, I think that's right. There were some of the ancient philosophers who did think pleasure was the sole good. But even they at least knew that many pleasures lead to pains, as you say. And they thought, well, the highest pleasure would have to be the kind of pleasure that is not associated with pain. And so they said, so getting drunk is not going to be that. The next morning, you're, as some of my students used to say, on your knees praying to the porcelain god. It's not going to be drugs. It's not going to be this. It's not going to be that. All of those things are associated with pain. Wild sex, it's associated with pain. So they said, what is the pain that's unmixed with pleasure? And they thought it was pure intellectual contemplation. So, Epicurus has people in his garden behind the house, and they sip barley water, and they have their intellectual conversations and imagine that they're having a happy life. Well, like they're missing something too.
I wonder what your students would say, especially now, maybe compared to previous years and decades. What would they say about the pleasure and the happiness of you just giving them an A at the end of the day, or, you give a test and everybody just gets an A, no matter if they studied or they didn't study. And I wonder if that has changed over time, and the happiness that's derived of just getting a good mark, so to speak, as opposed to having done the work to earn that mark.
Well, a few of my students would probably like it if I did that. But the reason that they would like it is because those few students who would give that answer aren't really interested in learning the material. They want the mark so that they can go to law school. They want the mark so that they can get a job. And why do they want that kind of a job, or why do they want to go to law school? Because they want to make money. They want to pull down the big bucks. So what this is really involving, I think, is not the idea that the approval of the professor that A gives them pleasure, gives them happiness rather, but that wealth is going to make them happy. And on the other hand, any student who actually is interested in learning is going to recognize, I might get that A, but for what? It's not for anything. You want both the knowledge, there's happiness there, and you want also the knowledge that you attained to that knowledge, that it wasn't a fake, that you did well, that you worked hard, and the A signals, yes, I confirm that. And they want that. That's much sounder. It's much healthier.
You had written a bit about a person who, I think you read it as an online comment, who was talking about happiness through annihilation, and that was really profound. And I spoke with my wife a lot about that. What did you think about that? The kind of a happiness in nothingness.
It's interesting that annihilation, nothingness, the idea is becoming more popular today. Now, it takes different forms. One is, there's suicide. People just say, I'm miserable. If only I die, I'll be happy. Now, this is connected with what we said before. The idea of happiness is nothing but the absence of suffering and pain. But they're not thinking it through, because if they're dead if they're really extinguished when they're dead, then who is it that's experiencing the cessation of happiness and pain? They're not them. So there is a problem here. There are some very old philosophies that hold this view, and some very new ones. There's an Australian philosopher who wrote a book that made a stir a few years ago. I think the title of the book was Better Off Dead, something like that. He said that actually, considering the realities of human life, all of us would be better off dead. Or no, he said better never to have been born, better never to have existed. We would have been better off if we'd never been born, because he measured happiness in terms of pain and pleasure, and he thought the preponderance of pain over pleasure is always greater. It's curious then why he didn't kill himself if he thinks that way. But Buddhism is a very old philosophy that holds something like this. The idea now there are various versions of Buddhism, but I'm going back to Theravada Buddhism, the original. The idea is that the problem in life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. Desire comes from the illusion that you exist, because you don't have any, and so the only freedom is to be attained in nirvana, which really means annihilation. You lose the illusion that you exist, and so you're not suffering anymore. Now, this is very curious to me, because if you're only an illusion, then who is it that's suffering? And if you're only an illusion and the illusion disappears, then who is it that's experiencing the release from that suffering? So I don't think that this is satisfying either. But I think that the idea that happiness lies in freedom from pain and suffering, and that we just need peace in that sense, it may be coupled with the rise in interest in Buddhism among some of the new generations coming up. So yeah, annihilation takes a lot of forms. And some people think, well, you don't exist anyway, so you might as well just get with it. Come on, get real. People will even say the me this week is not the me of last week. Every time I do anything, anytime I make a decision, I change myself. So that self ceases to exist, and now myself is. And this is sometimes used as a bizarre sort of a justification for not holding to any of your commitments, or not making them in the first place, or thinking that you can break them. Because, the guy who promised to hey, babe, the guy who promised to love you until death do us part, he doesn't exist anymore. By the very act of making that vow, he changed, and by the very act of saying this to you, I'm changing even now. The person a minute ago who began this conversation doesn't exist. The postmodernism gets into this sometimes. We always talk about what I'm into this week, what my project is this week, what my relationship is this week, and it's all, well, even here in this era, there's an element of truth. Human life, under the circumstances of the fall, is broken. But this is the wrong way to approach that brokenness. It's rather to grasp it with both hands and say, okay, let's be broken.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. How would you start building happiness then? We've talked a lot about what happiness is not, or maybe not perfect happiness, or a wrong way to look at happiness. What's maybe a better way to look at happiness?
Okay, that's really two questions. Before thinking about a better way to think about happiness, thinking just about the first form of your question, how do we build it? Well, I think one element in building it is to encourage people to believe it's really possible. Because a lot of my students have given up on this. Just like people sometimes say, oh, you're never going to find a good mate. You just have to either never marry or settle. And settle means you marry a jerk and you expect a jerk, and you can always divorce if things get bad. And I think that people take the same attitude toward happiness. They say, all right, life is miserable. Sometimes they'll even get angry if you suggest to them that happiness might be possible, because they've been burned by the way that they've been living. And they're afraid that if they allow themselves to hope, they'll just be burned enough. So that paradoxically, they'll be more happy if they give up the hope of happiness. So we have to overcome that. And part of the purpose of my book is to help them overcome it. There's even a chapter, should we just, settle? But how can we actually do this? Well, let's distinguish. I think we have to distinguish between the imperfect, fragmentary, interrupted, incomplete happiness, which is available in this life, and which is nothing to sneeze at. Don't get me wrong, okay? But it is incomplete and fragmentary and so forth. And that perfect happiness that would leave nothing to be desired, that, as Thomas Aquinas says, that would lull all desire. Now, I think that happiness is only to be found in the face of God. And it isn't just a matter of Christian faith. Christian faith may tell you this is how to get in right relationship with God. But the possibility, but the fact that this has to be a possibility, I think, can be demonstrated even just by philosophical reasoning, which is what I try to do in the book, because we long for this. And every longing, just like everything else in us, is there for some reason. It would be pointless to have physical hunger if there were no such thing as food. Why would I have this longing for something that cannot be found anywhere in natural experience, unless it could be found, but I may have to go beyond natural experience to the creator of nature to find it. So I believe that that's possible. But getting back to the impartial happiness, the incomplete happiness of this life, which is what many of my readers will only be interested in. They may not be willing to take that next step with me. Well, okay, here, this might be called the worldly wise man's view of happiness. It's very incomplete and flawed because it won't take that next step. But okay, for this life, it's not too bad. You have to cultivate virtue. and hope for luck. If you're in extreme unremitting pain all the time, even with virtue, if somebody's torturing you, all of your friends, if you've been lied about and all of your friends have deserted you and you've been exiled on a desert island, you're probably not going to be happy. But and you can't do too much about that. But cultivate the virtues. And look, not only will the virtues help you to endure if you do have bad fortune, but frankly, the virtues are going to help you to endure good fortune. Think of all the lives that have been ruined because the guy won the lottery, or because he got all of his hopes and now he doesn't know what to do with them. He can't handle the fame or whatever. Aristotle said that good fortune in excess might better be called bad fortune. I think what he meant was good fortune in excess of what your virtues enable you to deal with. And it just isn't true that more and more of all the good stuff will make you happier and happier and happier. There's a point beyond which wealth is going to diminish your happiness instead of increase it. You can see this in the arc of suicide rates. They're very high among destitute people who are really hungry and can't keep food on the table, but they're also very high in wealthy, high status neighborhoods, and they're lower in the middle class. Isn't that interesting? So I think, it's not the end of the matter. It's not the end of the story. It's missing an essential chunk. But I would say cultivate the virtues and hope for good fortune.
What are some virtues? I get the gist that virtues are something that it's beyond just yourself. Is it? How would you describe or define virtue? Maybe even for somebody who's not necessarily religious, or, something that probably anybody could find as virtue, because that's something that's always up for debate.
And the classical doctrine of virtue, the cardinal virtues, justice and fortitude or courage and temperance and wisdom. These are things that a non-religious person ought to be able to understand. Aristotle understood these things. Cicero understood these things. And they do have reference to others besides ourselves. Why would we call justice a virtue? Justice involves our relations with other people. Why would we call justice a virtue if it's just all about yourself? People sometimes say, I'm looking out for number one, man. I'm looking out for number one. If you're only looking out for number one, frankly, you're not looking out for number one very well, because for human beings, we're social beings. For human beings, the good life is such that it isn't even the good life unless we are sharing it with others. Even Aristotle, who was no religious man in a Christian sense, even Aristotle understood that there have to be things that take you outside yourself. He said, a friend is another self. Now, isn't that interesting? I don't just care for my friend because he gives pleasure to myself, right? I'm interested in my friend because my friend sort of feels like myself to me. I'm wrapped up in his well-being like that. Certainly, that's my attitude toward my wife, toward my children, toward those closest to me. And so, yes, the virtues do take us beyond ourselves. People have all heard the idea that we are social. We are so by nature social, and they think that means that we're like cows. We have an instinct that impels us to be around other people. Well, I don't know if there's such an instinct or not, but I know that that's not what it's really about. What it's about is that we can't be complete. We can't live distinctively human lives unless we're with other people. Even our highest aspirations to know the truth, especially the truth about God, we need other people for this. And so this is one of the reasons why I delay all the discussion of the God questions until such a late point in the book. And I even explicitly reassure my God-phobic readers, don't worry, if you don't want to take that step with me, I'm not going to make you, but I hope that a lot of this is going to be helpful and useful to you for many, many, many pages before we get there.
If you go to the local bookstore, the bookstore is filled with books about happiness. Where do you think some of these books fall down, and maybe where do some of the books get it right? Because there's any normal, and don't name names. It's,
I don't actually want to name names, but I wrote a recent article like this. I've been sending it out to some of the periodicals to see if they might be interested in it. There was a very interesting interview by a happiness studies professor at one of the Ivy League universities. And it epitomized, I think, a lot of what I find wrong in those books and in that movement and then the popularity of these courses. I'll tell you one thing that they get right, though. They get right, and the person being interviewed here did. They get right that happiness is not found in wealth. The person in this interview even said, "This is the hardest sell for my students." I'm very glad that her students were honest with her. A lot of my students aren't. I say, "What is it? What is happiness?" And they know I'm teaching about ethics, and so they don't want to say wealth is happiness. They won't admit to believing that, but I know they do because that's why they choose their majors. Okay, they get that right, but here are some things that they get wrong. Often they'll say happiness requires meaning. Well, yes, it does. But they generally tend to a sort of a relativism of meaning. You might get your meaning charge from belief in God. You might get your meaning charge from your inner goddess. You might get your meaning charge from some cult, or from believing that there's immense worth in tantric practices or self-worship or something like this. But meaning is a very fuzzy term. Do you want to find your meaning in the truth? You really need to do that. A life where somebody says, "Well, I feel good most of the time, and but if it's based on a delusion, that may be a life with a lot of good feelings, but it's not what we would call a happy life." There is also, I find this curiously in those books, some of them will even say, "Well, we are social scientists here, and we don't want to get into the philosophy of what happiness is. So for our purposes, we'll just say happiness is a feeling that..." What do you mean you're not going to get into the definition of what happiness is? You just defined it. You said it's a feeling. Positive feelings is the expression these psychologists use. The very elementary mistake of thinking that happiness is what we're feeling instead of how we're doing, instead of an activity. The inability to distinguish between having a good time and having a good life. It's very basic to these approaches. There's also a sheer unwillingness to recognize the limitations of their own method. They say, "Well, we're not going to just philosophize from on high here. We're going to speak to people." Now they'll say, this person who was interviewed even said in the interview, "Our minds lie to us." That's true. We are capable of immense self-deception. That's why I think we need this reflective conversation about these things. But then she placed absolute faith in the results of self-administered, subjective, self-reporting happiness surveys. Are you happy? Well, if our minds lie to us, why is that even useful? If our minds lie to us, wouldn't you need to have a different method? There's the fact, the interviewer, I will blame this on him instead of on the lady whom I don't want to diss. I know this is hard to do. The interviewer said, "Why is it that people are still confused since we know so much more about happiness now than in all the centuries of the past? It's just assumed that is the case with no investigation. So why is it exactly that there's nothing to be learned from Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle? Is it that we know so much better than them? Is that they didn't have the results of thousands and thousands of self-administered, subjective, self-satisfaction happiness surveys? I think that there's a problem here, and so I think that this is very disappointing. One of these happiness researchers in his book said, "We found that happiness seems to be associated with altruistic feelings, and we did some research, and we found that these feelings become stronger when people watch clips from the Oprah Winfrey Show." But then they admitted that people don't necessarily act out in an altruistic way. There's just some enormous point missing here, and it's almost pathetic. It's almost funny to say, "Well, we got good results from showing people clips from Oprah Winfrey." This is hard. It's so important. I want to take my hat off to them for recognizing that it's important, and not just to want to study abnormal psychology as the whole be all and end all, but instead say, what is a good human life? But we need to be more serious.
And maybe as a way to wrap up today, besides buying your book, what do you think is something somebody who's just listened to this, one step they could take on a trip to happiness?
Okay, I wouldn't say don't think about happiness, but I would say don't obsess about it. Don't be asking yourself constantly, am I happy yet? Am I happy yet? Am I happy yet? Instead, the most important thing I would say is take the virtues seriously and try to practice them. It's not going to be a magic switch that makes you happy, but let me tell you, without the virtues, you're not going to be happy. Try to be a good person and let the chips fall where they may. You may be surprised at the results.